Arizona, 1887. An ordinary man made a choice that would forever change the course of his life and that of an entire tribe. When Thomas Mackenzie woke up that cold October morning, he never imagined that in less than 24 hours he would be face to face 300 Native American warriors in his own yard. But sometimes, Old West, a single gesture of humanity can rewrite the destiny of entire generations. This is the extraordinary story of how an act of honor transformed a lonely man into the most unlikely hero of the Arizona Territory. The sun was still struggling to break through the heavy when Thomas stepped out of his rustic cabin, located 15 miles from the nearest settlement of Flagstaff. He was a middle-aged man of 43 well-lived years, graying hair and hands. He had moved to these arid lands 3 years earlier after his wife Martha succumbed to tuberculosis in Denver. Thomas was known in the region as a fair man, but reserved. He raised a few head of cattle and maintained a small orchard that, against all odds, managed to produce decent apples in that seemingly infertile soil. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and he liked this, or at least he had learned to live with it. That morning, as he walked to check the fence of the south pasture, Thomas noticed something strange. Buzzards were circling in low formation over a rocky elevation about half a mile from his property. It wasn't uncommon to see these birds in the region, but there was something different about their flight. They seemed more agitated, more insistent. Intrigued, and with a growing premonition, Thomas saddled his horse, a brown Mustang named Copper, and headed to investigate. As he approached, a characteristic smell hit his nostrils, the unmistakable odor that passing leaves under the desert sun. What Thomas found left him breathless. Hidden among the red rocks, partially covered by sage bushes, was the body of a Native American warrior. The man was young, 25 years old, and even in his final condition radiated an impressive dignity. His traditional clothing, a leather tunic decorated with intricate beadwork and eagle feathers, was torn and stained, evidence of a recent confrontation. Thomas dismounted slowly, his heart racing. Relations between settlers and native tribes in the region had been tense for decades. Many of his neighbors would see that body as evidence of another problem resolved. Others would simply pass by, pretending not to have seen anything. But Thomas Mackenzie was not like the others. Kneeling beside the warrior, he noticed details touched him deeply. The young man had his hands carefully crossed over his chest, as if, even in his final moments, he had tried to maintain his dignity. Beside him was a magnificently crafted bow, with carvings that clearly told the story of great. A leather quiver contained arrows with polished obsidian points, the work of an experienced craftsman. But it was the necklace that impressed Thomas. Made of bear claws interspersed with bright turquoise, it was clearly the regalia of someone important, perhaps a chief's son or a warrior of great renown. Thomas removed his hat and stood in silence for a long moment. In the war between settlers and natives, it was easy to forget that on the other side there were also families' dreams. That young warrior had been someone's son, perhaps the father of children who were now searching for him without finding. "You don't deserve to stay here for the buzzard," his voice carried away by the desert wind. Thomas knew he was about to make a decision that could cost him dearly. In Old West culture, interfering in indigenous affairs, even if it was just to give a decent burial, was seen as betrayal by many settlers. There were stories of men who had been expelled from their communities for showing excessive sympathy for the natives. But as he observed the fallen warrior, Thomas remembered something his late wife Martha always said: "The measure of a man is not in how he treats those who can return his favors, but in how he treats those who can do nothing for him." The warrior could do nothing. In fact, burying him could bring trouble, but it was the right thing to do. Thomas returned home and spent the rest of the morning gathering the necessary material. He took his best shovel, some wooden boards to make a simple coffin, and a clean blanket to wrap the body. He also set aside some of his most valuable possessions, a handful of silver coins, a small Bible that had belonged to his wife, and, surprisingly, a small flask of whiskey he kept for special occasions. When he returned to the site, the sun was already high. Thomas worked under the scorching heat, digging a proper grave in the hard desert earth. It wasn't easy work. The soil was parched and full of stones, but he persevered. Every time the shovel hit a root or a rock, Thomas thought of the warrior's family, wondering if they were searching for him at that very moment. After 3 hours of hard work, the grave was ready. Thomas then did something that, in those times and in that place, was practically unprecedented. He decided to prepare the body according to what he knew about native custom. He had talked a few times with a trader named Jake Morrison, who maintained cordial relations with several tribes in the region. Jake had once told him that Native Americans believed that the way a person was buried determined their journey in the after. Warriors were traditionally placed in a resting with their weapons, facing east where the sun comes from, symbolizing rebirth. Thomas carefully wrapped the warrior in the clean blanket, positioned the bow and quiver beside him, and placed the bear claw necklace back around the young man's neck. Then, in an impulse he couldn't fully explain himself, he added his own gift, the silver coins, so the warrior wouldn't arrive in the spirit world empty-handed, the Bible as a symbol of respect between different beliefs, and a few drops of whiskey sprinkled over the earth as a libation he hoped would be accepted in any cult. Before covering the grave, Thomas improvised a prayer that mixed his own Christian beliefs with what he imagined would be appropriate for a native warrior. May the Great Spirit receive this brave warrior in his eternal place. May he find his ancestors' family know that departed with honor. May his journey be peace, and may his memory inspire courage in all who hear his story. The burial took the rest. When Thomas finished, he built a small marker using local stacked stones and placed on top a simple cross made from oak branches, not out of religious imposition, but as a universal symbol that there rested someone who was loved and remembered. As the sun set, painting the sky in orange and purple tones, Thomas remained beside the grave for a few more minutes. He had the strange sensation that he wasn't alone, as if invisible spirits witnessed his action. The wind whispered between the rocks, and for a moment swore he heard something that sounded like distant chants. "Rest in peace, warrior," he said finally, putting his hat back. "Your story will not be forgotten." Thomas returned home with a heavy heart, but also with a strange sense of peace. He had done what he believed was right, regardless of possible consequences. He prepared a simple dinner, beans, bacon, and strong coffee, and sat on his porch to observe the night sky. The desert stars shone with an intensity that still impressed him, even after 3 years living in that region. In Denver, city lights obscured much of the celestial spectacle. There, in the isolation of Arizona, the universe revealed itself in all its magnificence. While drinking his coffee, Thomas couldn't stop thinking of the warrior. Who was he? What tribe did he come from? How had he ended up in that place? The wounds he had observed suggested a confrontation, but with whom? And why? The night passed peaceful, but Thomas slept. His dreams were populated by images of mounted warrior, drums, and campfire. He woke several times, sweating, sensation that was being watched. Each time he got up to the window, he found only the silent darkness of the desert. The next morning, Thomas discovered the first signs that his action had not gone unnoticed. Footprints, dozens of them circling his property, as if invisible investigators had spent the entire night studying every inch of his land. The marks were distinctly different. The heavy boots of settlers, or the iron-shod hooves of domestic horses. These were moccasin prints, light and deliberate, accompanied by marks from unshod hooves, wild horses domesticated by the Thomas followed the footprints as far as he could. They extended in a complex pattern, as if multiple groups had approached from different directions, met at specific points to exchange information, and then dispersed again. It was like reading a silent conversation imprinted in the earth. Even more intriguing was what the footprints didn't show. There were no signs of hostility, no evidence of preparation for attack, no indication that anyone had tried to approach the house or structures. It seemed more like careful reconnaissance, respectful investigation. Near the place where he had buried the warrior, Thomas found something that left him speechless. Someone, or several someone, had been there during the night. The stone marker he had built had been carefully reorganized into a more elaborate pattern, forming a spiral that radiated from the central. Around the grave, small gifts had been placed: eagle feathers, polished stones of different colors, small bundles of aromatic herbs tied with leather strips, and a small leather pouch containing something that smelled like sacred tobacco. But the most significant gift was leaning against the cross, a magnificently carved war staff, decorated with symbols that Thomas couldn't decipher, but that clearly told an important story. It was an extraordinary piece of craftsmanship, the kind of object that would take months to create, and that certainly had great sentimental value for whoever possessed it. Thomas touched the staff with reverence. Someone had come during the night, seen what he had done, and decided to honor both the dead warrior and the man who had given him a decent burial. It was a silent, powerful communication. "We saw what you did. We respect your action. CSB." While examining the offerings, Thomas heard a sound that made his blood freeze, the distant sound of drums. It was a slow and solemn rhythm, like a heartbeat. It came from several directions at the same time, creating a complex symphony that echoed among the rocky hills. Thomas knew enough about native customs to recognize that this wasn't a sound of war, but of mourning, or perhaps celebration. It was impossible to determine exactly what it meant, but it clearly had a connection to the events of the last 24 hours. The drums continued for about an hour, gradually fading until only the wind remained. Thomas stood beside the grave throughout this time, respectfully removing his hat, feeling himself part of a ceremony he didn't fully understand, but that touched him. When silence returned, Thomas knew that something had changed forever. He was no longer alone in that desert. He had become part of something larger, a story that transcended the divisions between cultures and races. But he still had no idea what was to come. 3 days passed in relative tranquility, although Thomas continued to find evidence of surveillance. Small signs appeared regular, fresh footprints, stone arrangements that weren't there the day before, and occasional distant smoke rising from the surrounding hills, too little from settler campfires, but enough to indicate human presence. Thomas maintained his normal routine, caring for working in the orchard, repairing fences, but always with one eye toward the horizon. He didn't feel threatened, curious. There was something in the quality of the observation that suggested curiosity, hostility. It was as if he were being evaluated, studied, but not necessarily judged as an enemy. On the afternoon of the 4th day, while repairing a section of the north fence, Thomas saw a solitary figure approaching on horseback. At first, he thought it might be one of the neighbors, or perhaps a traveler, but as the figure approached, it became clear it was a Native American, mounted on a magnificently cared-for pinto. The man rode with the upright and confident posture of someone accustomed to long journeys through hostile territory. He wore traditional clothing, but also some pieces clearly acquired in trades with settlers, a mixture that suggested someone who served as an intermediary between two worlds. Thomas put down his hammer and walked slowly toward the house, keeping his hands visible and avoiding sudden movement. He carried no weapon, a conscious decision he had made after the burial, feeling it would be inappropriate to go armed while processing what had happened. The rider stopped about 50 yards from the house and dismounted. He was a middle-aged man, perhaps a few years older than Thomas, with long hair braided with leather ribbons and small feathers. His face was serious, but not hostile. There was an evident intelligence in his dark eyes and a dignity that immediately commanded respect. "You are Thomas Mackenzie," said the man in clear English, though with a distinct, it wasn't a question. "Yes, I am," replied Thomas, stopping at a respectful distance. "And you are?" "My name is Joseph White Eagle. I am of the Navajo, but I speak for many tribes today." The man paused, studying Thomas carefully. "You buried Morning Torch." The name hit Thomas like lightning. Morning. The warrior had a name, an identity, story. Suddenly the dead young man became even more real, more human. Morning Torch? That was his name? Joseph. He was the son of Strong Wind, chief of the Ute tribe, a young warrior but valorous. He was returning from a peace when he encountered bandits, men who attacked both your people and mine, making everyone pay for the crimes of few. The implication was clear. Morning Torch hadn't passed away in combat against settlers, but at the hands of outlaws who terrorized the region indiscriminately. It was a revelation that changed everything. "Why did you bury him?" asked Joseph, but his voice wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely curious. "Few of your people would do such a thing." Thomas considered the question carefully. How to explain a compulsion he himself didn't fully understand? "Because he was a human being," he said finally. "Because he had family who loved him. Because it's what my wife would have done." Joseph studied Thomas for a long moment. "Your wife? A wise." She was, surprised by the emotion the memory brought. She believed that kindness knows no boundaries of race or religion. Morning Torch was found 3 sons after his departure to the spirit world. "We found the bandits' tracks, followed them to the place where the final confrontation happened. But when we arrived where we expected to find disrespect, we found honor. The Native American gestured toward the distant grave. You didn't just bury Morning Torch. You honored him. You used your white man's customs, mixed with our custom. You gave gifts for his journey. You built a memorial. Thomas nodded, uncertain where the conversation. For 3 sons, the elders of the tribes talked, continued Navajo, Ute, Apache, even some Hopi came to the council. All wanted to understand, why would a white man do this? And did they reach a conclusion? Smiled for the first time, and his entire face transformed. Yes, they concluded that you are a man with a big heart, a man who sees beyond skin color, beyond differences in custom, a man who honors life, even in the presence. Thomas didn't know what to say. He hadn't expected recognition for his action. He had simply done what felt right. There are consequences for such a heart, and his expression became serious again. Consequences that will begin with the next sunrise. What kind of consequence? Joseph mounted his horse, preparing to leave. Tomorrow morning, look at your yard, and prepare to see what happens when the tribes decide to honor a man with a big heart. With those enigmatic words, Joseph White Eagle spurred his horse and galloped back to the east, leaving Thomas alone with 1,000 questions and growing anxiety about what the dawn would bring. Thomas spent the longest night of his life since Martha's. Joseph's words echoed in his mind. Prepare to see what happens when the tribes decide to honor a man with a big heart. What could that mean? He tried to continue his normal routine, prepared dinner for the animals, read a few pages of a worn book, but his mind couldn't concentrate on anything beyond Joseph's mysterious promise. Several possibilities in his head, from a gratitude festival to scenarios he preferred not to consider. Around 9 at night, Thomas decided he wouldn't be able to sleep even if he grabbed a cup of coffee and settled on his porch, determined to keep watch until dawn. If something was going to happen, he wanted to be prepared. The hours passed. The nighttime desert was more active than usual. Thomas could hear distant sounds he couldn't fully identify. They weren't the normal sounds of wildlife. There was a pattern, an intentionality that suggested coordinated human activity. Around midnight, he began to see lights in the surrounding hills. They weren't large fires, but small points of light that appeared and disappeared like blinking. It was as if dozens of small groups were camped in a wide circle around his property, each maintaining a silent vigil. As the night progressed, the sounds became more distinct. Thomas could occasionally hear the low neighing of horses, the distant murmur of human voices, and periodically, brief bursts of ritual chanting. It was clear that something significant was being prepared. Around 3 in the morning, Thomas noticed movement closer. Shadows moved among the bushes and rocks surrounding his property, but always maintaining a respectful distance. He didn't feel threatened. There was something deeply reverent in the quality of the movement. It was as if he were being protected, not surrounded. While watching, Thomas remembered stories he had heard about Native American customs. He knew that many tribes had elaborate traditions for honoring acts of courage and kindness, especially when they came from unexpected sources. He had heard of adoption ceremonies where strangers were accepted as honorary members of a tribe. There were stories of ceremonial gifts where entire tribes gathered to demonstrate gratitude for a significant act. But all of this was just rumors and secondhand stories. Thomas had never experienced anything like this personally, and certainly had never expected to find himself at the center of such an event. At 4:30 in the morning, the sky began to lighten in the east. Thomas could see that his suspicions were correct. There really were dozens of small camps circling his property. Smoke rose from carefully controlled fires, and figures began to move for purpose. At 5 in the morning, Thomas saw the first group approaching. They were 5 riders, all in elaborate ceremonial dress. Even at a distance, Thomas could see that their clothing was magnificently decorated with beads, feathers, and paint. They moved in formation, not like an attacking group, but like a formal delegation. Soon after, another group appeared from a different direction. Then, another and another. Thomas felt his breathing accelerate. Whatever was happening, it was much bigger than he had imagined. It wasn't just a few people. It was dozens of converging on his property from all directions. At 5:15, when the sun began to appear on the horizon, Thomas finally understood the magnitude of what he was witnessing. They kept group after group rider after family, men, women, children, elders, representatives of various, judging by the diversity of their dress and decoration. Thomas could distinguish at least 3 different styles of traditional clothing, suggesting that multiple tribes were indeed represented, and all of them were heading to his yard. At 5:30 in the morning, when the sun finally rose completely on the horizon, Thomas Mackenzie found himself with a spectacle that few white men had ever witnessed: 300 Native Americans completely filling his yard and the surroundings. It wasn't a terrifying sight, as he might have expected. It was majestic. The riders were organized into distinct groups by tribe, each group maintaining their own banners and symbols. Thomas could see Navajo, their characteristic blankets, Utes with their unique headdresses, Apaches with their traditional face paints, and even some who appeared to be Hopis from the distant mesa. It was an intertribal gathering of a scale that rarely happened, especially in times of tension with settlers. In the center of it all, mounted on a magnificent white horse, was a man who clearly was a figure of great authority. He was older, perhaps 60 years, with long graying hair decorated with golden eagle feathers. His headdress was elaborate, indicating high position. His clothing was richly decorated with beadwork that must have taken years. Joseph White Eagle rode forward and dismounted near the porch, stood, holding his. "Thomas Mackenzie," said Joseph in a loud voice, clearly speaking to both Thomas and the gathered crowd. "This is Strong Wind, chief of the Northern Utes and father of Morning Torch." Thomas felt his heart race. The father of the warrior he had buried was there, surrounded by hundreds of people from his people and allied tribe. For a terrible moment, Thomas wondered if he had misinterpreted the situation. Perhaps this was a tribunal, not an honor. But then Strong Wind dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward Thomas. His eyes were penetrating, but not hostile. There was pain in them, the pain of a father who had lost a son, but also something else, gratitude perhaps, respect. Strong Wind stopped about 6 feet from Thomas and spoke in his native language. His voice was deep and charged with emotion. Joseph translated, "He says, 'Man of the wooden house, you took my son from dishonor and gave him dignity. You honored a warrior you didn't know, from a people who are not yours. For this, all the tribes have come to show you that such kindness does not go unnoticed." Thomas didn't know what to say. He removed his hat and bowed respectfully. Tell him that any father would do the same for his son. That Morning Torch was clearly an honorable warrior who deserved a dignified rest, Joseph translated. And for the first time, Strong Wind smiled. It was a sad smile, but genuine. He spoke again, and Joseph continued translating. "He says that many of your people would have left Morning Torch for the buzzards, that you chose to see a son, not an enemy. For this, you will always be welcome in all the camps represented here today." Strong Wind then did something completely unexpected. He removed a magnificent necklace, a piece with bear claws interspersed with turquoise and sacred stones, and offered it to Thomas. "This necklace belonged to Morning Torch's grandfather," translated Joseph. "It is a symbol of protection and honor among our people. Strong Wind wants you to wear it, so that all will know you are a friend of the tribe." Thomas accepted the necklace with trembling hands. It was clearly a family heirloom, something of inestimable value. "I don't know if I can accept something," Joseph smiled. "To refuse would be an offense. And besides, there's more." As if it were a signal, representatives from each tribe began to approach. One by one they presented gifts to Thomas: hand-woven blankets with intricate patterns, beautifully crafted baskets, decorative bows and arrows, painted pottery, and even some horses, including a young pinto that had clearly been trained with great care. But the material gifts were only part of the ceremony. Joseph explained that each tribe was offering something even more valuable: protection and friendship. "From today," said Joseph, "you are under the protection of all the tribes represented here. If you need help, send smoke to the sky morning and afternoon for 3 days. Warriors will come. If anyone threatens you because of your friendship with us, we will know and respond. But I just did what any decent person would do." "No." Thomas turned to see an older woman approaching. She wore clothing that identified her as a healer or wise woman, and her eyes shone with. Joseph introduced her Silver Moon, a respected elder among the Navajo. "Not any person," she said in surprisingly fluent English. "Many of your people have passed by our fallen without a second glance. Some have even desecrated our sacred places. You chose to honor, not ignore. You chose unity, not division. She approached and gently touched Thomas's. My grandson was with Morning Torch when the bandits attacked. He escaped but saw everything, saw how Morning Torch fought bravely, how he fell with honor. But he also saw the bandits laugh and planned to leave the body for wild animals as a message to our people. Thomas felt a wave of anger and sadness. That's terrible. Yes, but then 3 days later, my grandson returned to recover his friend's body, and he found, instead of dishonor, a memorial. He found evidence that not all white men are the same. Hope. The ceremony continued until almost noon. There were chants in multiple native languages, ritual dances that told the story of his gesture, and speeches from various tribal leaders. Thomas was formally adopted by 3 different tribes, each giving him a name in their language. The Utes called him He Who Honors the Fallen, the Navajos Bridge Builder, and the Apaches Heart Without Boundaries. But perhaps the most moving moment came when a group of young warriors, led by someone Joseph identified as Morning Torch's best friend, performed a special dance. It was a modified war dance, Joseph explained, traditionally performed to honor fallen warriors. But this time, it also included elements that honored Thomas, symbolizing how an act of kindness could be as powerful as an act of courage in battle. When the ceremonies finally ended, the tribes began to disperse, but not before each group personally approached Thomas to greet him. Many spoke in broken English, others simply his hand or his shoulder, but all conveyed the same. He had earned their respect and friendship. Strong Wind was one of the last. Through Joseph, he conveyed a final message. My son now rests in peace, knowing he was honored by a good man. But more importantly, you showed that it's possible for our peoples to live in harmony. Morning Torch always believed peace was possible. Perhaps his final life purpose was to make that possibility real. When the last riders disappeared on the horizon, Thomas found himself alone again, but he didn't feel alone. His yard was full of gifts. His house was surrounded by evidence of a friendship that transcended cultures, and his heart was full of a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Martha's. Joseph White Eagle had remained behind. There's one more thing, responsibility that comes with the honor you received. Responsibility. Your story must be not just among our people, but among yours too. Many settlers live in fear, thinking all natives are enemies. Many of our people have lost hope that peace is possible. You proved that both sides are wrong. Thomas considered this. How can I tell such a story? Who would believe? Joseph smiled. Start small. Tell your neighbors. Tell in town. Some won't believe it's true, but others will see the possibility, and possibility is like seeds. Once planted, it can grow in unexpected places. In the months that followed, Thomas did exactly what Joseph had suggested. He told his story to anyone who wanted to hear. Initially, reactions were mixed. Some neighbors treated him with suspicion, seeing his friendship with the tribes as betrayal. Others were curious, asking questions about native customs and possibilities for peaceful trade. But gradually, something remarkable began to happen. The region began to see more trade between settlers and natives, mediated in part by Thomas's reputation as the man the tribes trust. And minor conflicts were brought to him for mediation. Native families occasionally camped near his property when traveling, knowing they would be safe there. Thomas also fulfilled a promise he had made to himself. He maintained Morning Torch's grave. Once a month he visited it, bringing wildflowers or small gifts. He frequently found evidence that others had also been there, family members, friends, or simply people who had heard the story and wanted to pay their respects. The grave became a symbol in the region, a physical reminder that humanity could transcend racial and cultural divisions. Travelers occasionally made detours, and some native families included it in their pilgrimage. Joseph White Eagle became a regular visitor to Thomas's property. The two men developed a deep friendship, united by their common belief. Joseph taught Thomas about native traditions and beliefs, while Thomas shared his own culture and history. They often spent entire nights talking about philosophy, spirituality, and the possibilities of a future where different peoples could coexist peacefully. One of the most significant conversations happened on a starry winter night, 6 months after the great ceremony. Have you ever wondered, said Joseph, why it was you who found Morning Torch that day? Thomas considered the question. Chance, or maybe destiny, you believe in. Joseph shook his head. Our people believe Nothing happens by chance. We believe Morning Torch was guided to that place, and you were guided to find him because the Great Spirit knew you both were needed for something greater. Greater how? Change, said Joseph simply. Real, lasting change. Not the change that comes from war or politics, but the change that comes from the heart. You didn't just bury a warrior, Tom. You planted a seed of possibility that will grow for generations. The influence of Thomas's story spread far beyond his small region of Arizona. Travelers carried the story to other parts of the territory, and eventually it reached the ears of journalists in larger cities like Phoenix and Tucson. Although some accounts were exaggerated, one version claimed Thomas had been visited by 1,000 warriors. The essence of the story remained true. The result was growing interest in the possibility of peaceful relations between settlers and natives. Some government officials even visited Thomas to discuss how his experience could inform more effective policy. Although Thomas was skeptical about bureaucracy's ability to replicate genuine gestures of human kindness, he cooperated in hopes that some good might result. More significantly, other people began to follow Thomas' example. There were reports of settlers in other regions offering help to natives in difficulty, or at least treating them with basic respect. It wasn't a universal transformation. There were still tension and conflict, but it was a beginning. Thomas also received one spring afternoon, a year after Morning Torch's burial, a group of native women arrived at his. They came from a distant village and had traveled for weeks specifically to meet him. The group's leader was a woman named Dancing Cloud, mother of a young warrior who had been taken from life in conflict with soldiers some months. She had heard Thomas's story and wanted to see for herself the man who had honored another person's son. "My son also lies in strange land," she said through an interpreter, "but no one honored him. No one marked his resting place. Can you teach me how to make a proper memorial?" Thomas was deeply touched. He spent 2 days with Dancing Cloud, a companion, teaching them not just how to build a physical memorial, but discussing the philosophies of mourning and remembrance that had informed his action. When they left, they carried with them not just practical knowledge, but a deeper understanding of how honor can transcend cultures. This pattern repeated several times. Thomas found himself becoming an informal counselor for people from both cultures who struggled with questions of forgiveness, reconciliation, and bridge building. He never sought this role, but seemed to have a natural ability to help others see beyond their cultural differences to the shared humanities underneath. The true test of the transformation Thomas had helped initiate came 2 years after Morning Torch's burial. Tensions in the region had increased due to disputes over water and grazing rights. Some more aggressive elements from both sides were pushing for confrontation, arguing that peaceful coexistence was impossible. The situation reached its peak when a group of bandits, the same ones who had taken Morning Torch's life, attacked a mixed camp of native and settler families who were working together to establish a trading post. Several people were wounded, property was destroyed, and the bandits left false evidence designed to make it appear the attack had come from one group against the other. The strategy worked initially. Angry settlers gathered in Flagstaff talking about retaliation against all the tribes in the region. Simultaneously, young warriors from various tribes began painting their faces for war, convinced that the settlers had broken all peace agreements. The territory was on the brink of a war that could have lasted years and cost hundreds of lives. It was Joseph White Eagle who came first to Thomas. "My friend," he said, clearly desperate, "the peace we built is crumbling. The young ones from both sides want blood. The elders are losing control. If something isn't done soon, everything we worked for will be lost." Thomas knew Joseph was right. He could feel the tension in the air, see it in the eyes of the few neighbors who still spoke with him. Some had even accused him of having blood on his hands for encouraging trust in the native. "What do you think we can do?" asked Thomas. "There's a meeting tomorrow at sunset," said Joseph. "Leaders from all the main tribes. They're going to decide whether to declare war on the settlers. You need to be there." "Me? But I'm just a farmer." "What influence could I have?" Joseph grabbed Thomas's shoulder. "Don't you understand yet? You've become a symbol. To our people, you prove that not all white men are enemies. To some of your people, you prove that peace is possible. If you speak against war, some will." Thomas spent the night in agony. He was just a simple man who had made a simple choice to honor a fallen warrior. How had he become responsible for preventing a war? But then he remembered his late wife's words. The measure of a man is not in how he treats those who can return his favors, but in how he treats those who can do nothing for him. Morning Torch could do nothing for Thomas when he found him, but honoring him had led to changes Thomas never could have imagined. Perhaps this was another opportunity to do the right thing, regardless of personal consequence. The Intertribal Council was held at a sacred site known as Eagle's Rest, a natural amphitheater formed by red sandstone cliffs about 20 miles from Thomas's. As Joseph and Thomas approached on horseback, Thomas could see dozens of fires scattered across the floor, each representing a different clan or tribal. Thomas had never seen so many Native Americans gathered in one place. There had to be over 400 people present, representing nearly every tribe within 200 miles. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. If these people decided on war, the bloodshed would be unprecedented. Joseph led Thomas to a designated area where non-tribal guests were permitted. A few other white men were present, traders who had earned tribal trust over many years, but Thomas was clearly the most recent addition to this exclusive group. As the sun set, the formal council began. A massive fire was lit in the center of the amphitheater, and one by one, tribal leaders spoke. Thomas couldn't understand most of what was said, but Joseph provided whispered translations when crucial points were. The speeches painted a grim picture. Young warriors from multiple tribes had already formed war parties. Weapons were being prepared. Ancient allies were being contacted. Some leaders spoke passionately about the need to strike first before the settlers could organize their own response, but not all voices called for war. Several elder chiefs spoke about the cost of conflict, reminding the assembly of previous wars that had decimated tribal populations and led to forced relocation. They urged caution and negotiation. The debate continued for hours. Thomas felt increasingly helpless as he listened to the passionate arguments from both sides. These were intelligent, thoughtful people wrestling with an impossible situation. How could he, an outsider, possibly influence such a momentous decision? Finally, as the fire began to burn low, strong wind stood to address the assembly. The entire amphitheater fell silent. His voice carried clearly in the still night air as he spoke in measured, careful tone. Joseph translated in whispers. He's talking about Morning Torch, about how his son met his end at the hands of bandits, not settlers. He's reminding everyone that the real enemies are those who profit from conflict between our peoples. Strong Wind continued speaking, and Thomas was surprised to hear his own name mentioned several times. The old chief gestured toward where Thomas sat, and hundreds of pairs of eyes turned in his direction. He's telling them about you, Joseph urgently, about how you honored Morning Torch, about the ceremony, about the bridge you helped build between our peoples. He's asking whether war will honor that bridge or destroy it. When Strong Wind finished speaking, another figure rose, an Apache war chief whose fierce reputation was known throughout the territory. Thomas's heart sank, expecting a passionate call for immediate warfare. Instead, the war chief spoke quietly about his own losses in previous conflict, about children who would never return home, about villages left empty, about the cycle of revenge that consumed generation after generation. He challenged the younger warriors to consider whether they wanted their own children to inherit endless war. The momentum of the council was shifting, but Thomas could see it wasn't. Too many voices still called for war. Too much anger still burned in too many hearts. That's when Joseph White stood up. "My friends," he said, speaking in English so that Thomas could understand, "we have heard many wise words about honor, about justice, about protecting our people. But I want to speak about hope," he gestured toward Thomas. "This man came among us as a stranger. He owed us nothing. We were not his people, not his family, not his responsibility. But when he found one of our own in need, even in passing, he chose honor over indifference. He chose connection over stronger. Some say this proves white men can be true. Others say it's nothing, that he is one man. But I say it proves something more important. It proves that change is possible. Not change forced by war or politics, but change that comes from the heart." He turned to address the assembly. "If we choose war tomorrow, we choose to become what our enemies say we are, savages who know only violence. If we choose peace, we choose to become what our ancestors dreamed we could be, a people strong enough to forgive, wise enough to build bridges, brave enough to hope. The amphitheater remained silent for long minutes after Joseph finished speaking. Then, slowly, an elderly Hopi woman spoke briefly in her own language, then repeated her words in broken English: "Peace for children, war for no one." One by one other voices joined hers. Not all, there were still those who called for war, but enough to tip the balance toward hope instead of hatred. The council's decision wasn't unanimous, but it was clear. The majority chose to pursue peace over war. However, this choice came with conditions that would test Thomas's commitment to the friendship he had helped forge. The council decreed that for peace to work, there had to be accountability for the crimes that had been committed. The bandits who had taken Morning Torch's life and attacked the mixed settlement had to be brought to justice, not by tribal warriors, but through cooperation between native and settler communities. Furthermore, Thomas was asked to serve as an official mediator in future disputes. His property would become a neutral meeting ground where grievances could be aired and solutions negotiated. It was an enormous responsibility for a simple farmer, but the tribal leaders insisted that his unique position, trusted by both sides, made him indispensable to the peace process. Thomas accepted, knowing that his quiet life was forever changed. Over the following months, his property became a hub of activity. Delegations arrived regularly to discuss water rights, grazing disputes, trade agreements, and territorial boundaries. Thomas found himself learning not just about native custom, but about the complex legal and political frameworks that governed frontier life. The search for the bandits became a joint effort that took nearly a year to complete. Working together, tribal scouts and territorial lawmen tracked the outlaws across 3 states before finally cornering them in a canyon near the Colorado border. The capture was achieved without bloodshed, a victory that many saw as validation of the cooperative approach. When the bandits were brought to trial, Thomas testified about finding Morning Torch's body and the subsequent events. His testimony, corroborated by tribal witnesses, helped ensure convictions on multiple. More importantly, the trial became a public demonstration that justice could be achieved through law rather than vengeance. The success of the Arizona peace process attracted attention far beyond the territory's borders. Newspaper articles about the farmer who prevented a war appeared in publications from San Francisco to New York. Government officials began studying Thomas's mediation methods as potential models for resolving conflicts in other regions. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source: the President of the United States. In the spring of 1890, 3 years after Morning Torch's burial, Thomas received a letter bearing the presidential seal. President Benjamin Harrison formally commended Thomas for his exceptional service to peace and understanding between peoples and invited him to Washington to advise on federal policy. Thomas was torn about the invitation. He had little faith in politicians' ability to replicate genuine human connections through bureaucratic. But Joseph White Eagle convinced him to accept, arguing that even small influences on federal policy could prevent conflicts in other regions. The trip to Washington was Thomas's first time east of the Mississippi since his youth. The capital's bustle and grandeur overwhelmed him, but he was most struck by how detached the policymakers seemed from the realities of frontier life. Most had never spoken with a Native American, let alone lived alongside tribal communities. Thomas's meetings with government officials were frustrating, but occasionally productive. He repeatedly emphasized that successful peace required genuine respect rather than mere tolerance, and that sustainable solutions had to address the legitimate needs of all parties rather than simply imposing the will of the stronger side. His most impactful moment came during a speech to a joint session of congressional committees. Standing before dozens of senators and representatives, Thomas told the story of Morning Torch's burial and its after. He spoke without notes, from the heart, about the transformation he had witnessed in his own small corner of the frontier. "Gentlemen," he concluded, "I am not a politician or a policy expert. I am simply a farmer who chose to see a fallen human being rather than a fallen enemy. That choice led to friendship, where there had been fear, cooperation where there had been conflict, and hope where there had been hatred. If such transformation is possible in the Arizona desert, it is possible anywhere, but only if we choose to see each other's humanity rather than each other's differences. The speech was reported in newspapers across the country and helped shift public opinion toward more humane treatment of Native Americans. While Thomas's direct influence on federal policy was limited, his story became part of a larger movement toward peaceful coexistence. Thomas returned to Arizona with mixed feelings about his Washington experience, but renewed commitment to the work he had begun. The mediation center at his property had evolved into something resembling a small town, with permanent structures for visiting delegations and a staff of translators and clerks to handle the increasing volume of disputes. The success of the peace process was measured not just in the absence of war, but in the growth of genuine cooperation. Joint ventures between settler and native communities became common. Trading posts operated by mixed partnerships, cattle ranches that employed workers from both cultures, and agricultural projects that combined European farming techniques with indigenous knowledge of desert cultivation. Thomas married again in 1892 to a widow named Sarah Collins, who had been serving as a teacher for both settler and native children in the community that had grown around his property. Sarah shared his vision of cultural bridge building and brought her own skills in education and administration to their partnership. Together, they established the first integrated school in the Arizona Territory, where children from multiple backgrounds learned alongside each other. The school became a powerful symbol of the possibility for peaceful coexistence and produced a generation of young people who saw diversity as strength rather than threat. But the greatest test of the peace Thomas had helped build came in 1898, when tensions over war policies threatened to reignite old conflicts. Some government officials proposed conscripting Native American warriors for the war effort, while certain tribal leaders saw the war as an opportunity to reclaim traditional territories while the military was distracted. Once again, Thomas found himself at the center of crucial negotiations. Working with Joseph White Eagle and other tribal leaders, he helped craft an agreement that allowed for voluntary Native American participation in the war effort while protecting tribal sovereignty and territorial rights. The agreement held, and many Native American volunteers distinguished themselves in the war, earning recognition that helped improve relations between their communities and the broader American society. As Thomas entered his 60s, he began to reflect on the extraordinary changes that had resulted from that single morning when he chose to honor a fallen warrior. What had begun as a simple act of human decency had evolved into a model for peaceful coexistence that influenced policy across the grave of Morning Torch had become a pilgrimage site visited by thousands of people from diverse backgrounds who came to pay their respects to both the fallen warrior and the man who had honored him. A small town had grown around Thomas's property, officially named Harmony, in recognition of its role in fostering cross-cultural cooperation. Joseph White Eagle, now in his 70s, remained Thomas's closest friend and collaborator. Their friendship had become legendary, inspiring songs and stories among tribal communities and serving as proof that genuine bonds could transcend cultural boundaries. In 1903, on the 16th anniversary of Morning Torch's burial, the tribal councils organized a special ceremony to honor Thomas's lifetime of service to peace. Representatives from over 50 tribal groups gathered at Harmony for a celebration that lasted 3 days and nights. The centerpiece of the ceremony was the presentation of a sacred eagle feather staff, carved with symbols representing every tribe that had benefited from Thomas's mediation effort. The staff was accompanied by a formal declaration naming Thomas as an honorary chief of the Intertribal Peace Council, a position that had never before been offered to a non-Native American. But perhaps the most meaningful honor came from an unexpected source. Morning Torch's nephew, now a young man of 25, who had traveled from the Ute Reservation specifically to meet Thomas. "My uncle's spirit has watched over this place," he said through an interpreter. "He has seen how his final rest became the seed of something beautiful. Our family will remember forever that honor leads to honor, kindness to kindness, and peace." Thomas Mackenzie passed away peacefully in 1910, surrounded by family and friends from multiple cultures. His funeral was attended by over 1,000 people, including tribal leaders, government officials, settlers, and the children from the school he had helped establish. He was buried next to Morning Torch's grave, requested. The two men, one native, one white, brought together by chance and united by honor, rested side by side as symbols of what was possible when people chose understanding over hatred. The story of Thomas Mackenzie and Morning Torch continued to inspire long after both men were gone. Their graves became a national monument in 1935, visited by millions of people seeking to understand how a single act of kindness could change the course of. The town of Harmony continued to thrive, becoming a center for cultural exchange and education. The school Thomas and Sarah founded evolved into a university known for its programs in conflict resolution and intercultural studies. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was found in the countless individual acts of kindness and understanding that Thomas's example inspired. Letters poured in from across the country and around the world telling stories of people who had chosen compassion over indifference, bridge building over wall building, honor over hatred. On the morning of October 15, 1887, when Thomas Mackenzie decided to bury a fallen warrior with honor, he had no idea he was planting seeds that would grow into forests of hope. He simply did what felt right in his heart, what his beloved Martha would have done, what any decent human being should do when faced with another's suffering. That single choice, to see a son rather than an enemy, to honor rather than ignore, to build rather than destroy, proved that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things, followed their conscience rather than their fear. As the sun rose on that October morning so many years ago, it illuminated not just the Arizona desert, but the possibility that love could triumph over hatred, that understanding could overcome prejudice, and that peace could be built one human heart. And at sunrise, 300 tribesmen filled his yard, not as conquerors or enemies, but as friends honoring a man who had shown them that hope was possible, that bridges could be built across any divide, and that the measure of a person's life was not in what they gained for themselves, but in what they gave to others. The story of Thomas Mackenzie reminds us that each of us has the power to change the world, not through grand gestures or political movements, through simple acts of human kindness. Sometimes all it takes is choosing to honor rather than ignore, to include rather than exclude, to love rather than fear. Sometimes all it takes is doing the right thing, even when no one is watching, even when there's no reward, even when it might cost us something. Sometimes all it takes is remembering that on the other side of every cultural divide, every racial barrier, every religious difference, there are human beings with families who love them, dreams that inspire them, and stories that deserve to be remembered. Thomas Mackenzie understood this truth on a cold October morning in 1887, and his understanding changed the world.